This is Speakeasy Theology with Chris Green.
Jordan, welcome back. It's good to see you.
Great to see you, Chris. Thanks for having me back.
I know since the last time we've talked, you've started a new job, and we were just talking before I hit record. You have a new class to teach coming up.
Yeah, just called Understanding the Bible.
They're trusting you with the weightier matters, are they not?
And of course it's starting next week, and I was still working on. You know how we are. It's like when we are given this freedom, it becomes a sort of curse almost, where it's like, oh man, because I have to presume from what I've heard from other colleagues that a lot of the students just don't even really have, like, you can count less and less on them having any familiarity with just the basics. And so, of course, what I have to do is complicate it, and because I'm thinking, well, to me, it raises this whole hermeneutical circle thing in a different key, where it's like, well, what is their buy-in? Like, what is the motivation for studying all the parts of this massive book, even just a survey form, if they don't have a glimpse of the whole? Like, what does it mean to call this inspired? So I'm like, so I just settled on basically carving up the semester into two main parts, though very unequal, just the letter and the spirit. The letter will be the bulk of it, because that's just sort of getting the narrative down and just studying a few books in their entirety. But I don't know, man. It's going to be risky.
You need to post updates. We need these kind of notes from beyond as you're working through that. That'll be a lot of fun. You've taught one semester, right? I mean, you finished one.
Yeah.
How did that go?
It was great. Yeah, it was really good. It was fun because I basically had multiple sections of a few classes, but I had two classes last semester. This semester I have three, but the two were very different because they're very different demographics. One was just sort of like an introduction to Christian theology or doctrine, but that was primarily majors and minors. So and it was also kind of a little bit of a smaller class, so that was fun. We got into a lot of we were all over the place. I mean, anywhere from like sort of conciliar Christology to Gospel of Mark, or and this isn't in order, or to like liberation theology to eschatology. And so we were all over the place. That was fun. And then my other course was again one of these courses. They're just like, they throw a name at you, but basically they say make up a course of whatever you want to teach. And so I taught a class called for the core non-majors, mandatory sort of credit for juniors, called God, the Human, and the Cosmos. And that was fun. It was basically like my running thesis or argument throughout the course is you can't think of one of those without thinking of all of them.
Right.
And so we looked at a bunch of ancient cosmologies, I guess you could say, from Plato to we looked at there's a lot of, we looked at like a Native American myth. We looked at all these different things, and then of course Genesis, and then we had a unit on early Christian conceptions and cosmology. So we kind of got into like Augustine and Gregory of Nyssa's reading of Genesis. That was really fun. And then the last half of the semester was just we actually turned to modern scientific pictures of cosmology and different tips from different directions to kind of affect a synthesis between the two. So it was really fun. It worked out.
How did they track with Augustine and Gregory? I mean,
oh man, it was definitely some of the hardest stuff. Although at least for a few of them, the feedback was like this one student in particular was like, I had no idea about this. They found the reading difficult. But it wasn't. But it was because as you well know, and as you've taught yourself probably many times, like it's already hard enough to just kind of for them to read the Bible,
right? Yes,
and to think of just things like genre and so forth, and and I'm not denigrating. It's just sort of where we are right now.
That's right.
So it's hard enough for them to read the Bible, but then when you throw in there like Augustine's just sort of attempt to describe the two dynamics of the act of creation as both temporal and eternal, but that I think I've realized about myself that I lean into all of the confusion. And I try to use that pedagogically, maybe better or worse, depending on the day. But I try to I try to really draw that out as the way to link up with them. Like, wasn't that really, first of all, very different than maybe you would expect, or maybe that you would read it or have heard a preacher preach on it. But then secondly, it is kind of an interesting question, right? Like I had him, I was like, I even had invited him up to the board. I'm like, somebody draw me a picture of God creating.
Mm.
What is the picture? Like, what's the image actually that we're working with? And kind of work out from there. So those texts were risky because I basically knew they weren't going to get most of the text by reading it.
Right. Sure.
But I had built up enough of a rapport with him at that point that they came to class waiting to kind of hopefully have some of it, unfolded a little more.
Mm-hmm.
And so we used the class time for that. But yeah, I don't know. It's always, I'm never quite sure how it's going to work out. I'm always like, this is risky, but it's kind of also who I am. I'm just sort of leaning into who I am.
I love it. You've also been working on translation, Maximus's letters. Talk to us about that, how it's going. I'm sure teaching slowed the process down a little.
Definitely slowed it down. I did manage to finish about 2 or 3 letters this past semester, but that was all I could really muster. And I kind of suspect this coming semester I'll even get less done. However, our semester, just because of like the late date of Easter, there was a lot of weird scheduling things where I'm more or less done actually teaching by like mid-April.
Oh, wow.
Because we've got like a Easter break there, and then we only have like one class after that. So anyway, like basically everything's done by May. So I'm looking at May, and I'm just like, that's the time. So I really think May and into June I will complete that project.
Talk to us a little bit about how the project, like, what are the surprises for you as it's unfolded? I mean, obviously these are letters you knew already, but
Yeah.
translating them is something else altogether. And
Yeah.
I have no doubt that you turned up. I mean, I've done very little translation work, but the little bit that I did, which was with stuff Jensen had written in German, there are always, or there were for me at least, surprises there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was so far some of the like bigger things would be, yeah, you're right. It's just you're translating the content, it just hits you a little differently. And so, like, well, for one thing, I should just say for people, like, what is interesting to me, and what, of course, initially drew me to this topic or to this project, and when I mentioned it to Father John Bear years ago now, at this point, because I had the idea a long time ago, he was like very supportive because I think the big immediate interest is Maximus's most extended Christological reflection. Basically, come across 4 or 5 letters in this collection, and they are some of the longest letters. I mean, so in terms of, like, I'm translating 49 letters, but honestly, these 4 or 5 almost make up over a third of the actual quantity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, so I had mined those quite a bit for my book, but I think, I don't know. When I went back through and translated letter 12, which is one of these huge ones, this 21-page single spaced letter, I couldn't really I couldn't really believe how willing Maximus was to try to affect a synthesis between the Chalcedonian position and the Miaphysite, or they would maybe consider like this the Cyrilian impulse, to the point where in one moment, and I don't know, it just hadn't registered with me the way it does now. He actually says that both formulas, both the one person and two natures, and then the one incarnate nature of the word, which is a phrase that Cyril had used, thinking it was from Athanasius, but sort of awkwardly later turns out it's from Apollinarius, and so. But nevertheless, Maximus says in that letter at one point, he makes the argument that actually they're both equally necessary to affirm.
Mm.
So usually what he does with a tough saying, like say from Dionysius, that a certain saying that sounds like almost monergism, like there's just one activity of Christ, he'll sort of just give it a creative, but usually pretty interesting interpretation that is amenable to his position.
Mm-hmm.
He does do that a little bit here, and on a few occasions with the Cyrillian Miaphysite formula. But he But he also, in this letter, he goes on to say, though, that but it's equally necessary, is the language he uses,
Hmm.
to say, to affirm and confess this, just as much as it is to affirm and confess Chalcedon. So there's moments like that. So I've had like some Coptic priests and stuff very interested in that kind of thing, just for ecumenical
Yeah.
reasons. So anyway,
Do
but
you think
so there's that.
before you leave that, like, how is that different from how he's treating Dionysius's theandric operations? I mean, talk to us a little
Yeah.
bit about how all of that hangs together for you. Is that why he's saying it's necessary in order to say what Dionysius says about this one new operation? Because he's already, right, in ambiguous said that this has to be right? We have to affirm this Dionysian line, which is already Cyrillian, already open to that Miaphysite
Right.
tradition.
Yeah, and it's actually very analogous in the sense that, like, so for example, the like Maximus will note a certain theandric activity. That's the phrase,
Mm-hmm.
the exact phrase that Dionysius uses. He'll note things like, well, it doesn't say one; it says It's indefinite. A certain theandric activity. So he'll say it's not saying one. And then theandric, of course, is that duality that
Right,
he
right.
wants to get, and he reads it. And he can do that with a one incarnate nature. He can say, well, it's there. There you do have one, and then you have incarnate humanity, nature understood as divinity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that wouldn't fly for a lot of people in that tradition, but it just seems to me that in letter 12, he kind of goes a little beyond that and says, like, almost he countenances a kind of sense in which the very formulation, I almost want to say dialectical formulation of oneness, the emphasis on the oneness here, as it's stated, one incarnate nature, alongside the Chalcedonian one person in two natures, is a way in which, like, you can almost mutually purify both formulations by saying them both
Mm.
from possible misunderstandings. Now, I think Maximus would say he would want to think that the authors, or the church fathers, or I mean the bishops and stuff at Chalcedon, in a sense, intended that. But whether or not we buy that, we could just say he thinks God somehow intends that. So I think the difference is just that it's a nice moment of what I think it was Grillmeyer who called this the sort of extreme Neo-Chalcedonianism, which is this insistence on a both and simultaneous confession,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which, like, what he would call a strict Neo-Chalcedonian would be a little more hesitant about, because it's like, no, Chalcedon is the definitive formula. It's not like it has an equal. And so it's one of those moments where I think you can see the quote unquote extreme, I would say extreme willingness to kind of countenance the two, the one and the two. We got to say the one and the two, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if that really gets at what you were saying, but that's
Well, I guess what I'm thinking about recently, this Christology I'm trying to write, and
mm-hmm.
I hope no one at Baylor is listening. And I'm a bit behind schedule at this point, but I'm really struck working through this again, just how many connections I'm seeing with someone like Bonhoeffer, who's in that Lutheran tradition that shapes Jensen, and it's Cyrillian. But the best I can tell, Bonhoeffer is not reading Maximus, and he's, of course, not drawing on Dionysius. Luther famously says, right, ignore Dionysius altogether.
Right.
So you've got that line that seems to be like holding at arm's length Dionysius, and even I don't think that Bonhoeffer had read Maximus at all, but holding all of that at arm's length, knowingly or not. But then the conclusion he reaches is so similar to what you see in Dionysius and Maximus. And there you're gonna write that whole line. Mm-hmm. And I'm struck by how consistent all of that is. I don't know what to make of it exactly, except to say that I think what Jensen lived out himself which is, I've told you this before, but one of my conversations with him, he said that he kind of intuited or came to his basic Christological conviction before he had really read any theology.
Mm-hmm.
And that reading theology just kept confirming for him until finally he read Maximus and realized, okay, this is what I've been trying to say all along, right? This is like, even as an undergraduate student, he somehow had stumbled into a feel for it. And I think he got the feel for it from being around Lutheran Christology, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he had kind of taken it in, so to speak. And it's striking to me how that holds, like if you start with that conviction that in Christ the impossible has been made possible because the divine and the human are not just as the Lutherans will say, not just two boards glued together, but a sword plunged into the fire. There's real communion here. Like once you have that conviction, then the question is just, can you follow through on the implications? Do you dare to follow through on what that must mean? And letter 12, it sounds to me like he's following through on what that must mean, almost like taking the next step from what's already there in his reflections on Dionysius and the theandry action,
exactly,
or operation.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And it's always been fascinating to me. You can only read into this so much, but there's pretty good evidence that, like when it comes to the Ambigua, as you know, like there are two different works called the Ambigua. Yep. There's the Ambigua to Thomas, which are just 5, and then there's the more famous Ambigua to John, which are like the 70. Well, I guess it would have been 65 originally, or 64, and altogether they just are usually now referred to as the Ambigua. But what's interesting is it's pretty clear that the Ambigua to John, the long big one, was written prior, and that one mostly deals with phrases from Gregory of Nazianzus.
Mm-hmm.
The Ambigua to Thomas, the shorter 5 Ambigua work, that one is written later than the big one, and that one is much more focused on Christological issues, both in Gregory but also in Dionysius, as you said, Ambiguum 5 especially. And
which is what I'm thinking about here, right? Obviously.
Exactly, yes. And that, I think, is one of, I just think that's such a key text. Like, it's so, I think what's out there in English right now, that is the most important Christological text in Maximus's corpus. I think that the letters will supplant that in a way, although it still kind of does retain a certain sort of uniqueness. But when those two collections are brought together, those two works are brought together, the order is switched from the chronology.
Right.
And that's clear. And it's pretty good. Some people have made the case, and I think it's plausible, that Maximus himself had a hand in that. He's the one who ordered it that way. And what I like to say, this is the part where it's pure speculation, I couldn't prove it. What I'd like to think is that shows you a sort of the frame of mind that he's having. And what he thinks is, if you get the points of the first short Ambiguum, the more Christological focus, which crescendos in Ambiguum 5, then everything else he says throughout all the rest of Ambigua, which branch in every direction all the time, deification, creation, the doctrine of the Logia, and Ambiguum 7, all that stuff. It is, of course, was the argument I tried to make in my book, but like, I do think that's sort of like, that is the same logic. That is the sort of way you think through, like, or in your terms there, like, that is how you're following through in all these different arenas. Right?
That's right. Yes. And I love the detail of, it's convincing Thomas so that you can become John, right? So there's a way,
exactly.
In a playful read of those arrangements is, first we've got to address these doubts about what really has happened here in Jesus. And it's why we have to begin with these Christological difficulties, and why I think I love the way that you put that. Like, he's built up to what are we talking about? We talk about this theandric activity, or that Dionysius, the most blessed, wise Dionysius has written of. Like, if you can get that, then everything else I'm going to say, right, will track. And I think that's exactly right.
And if we wanted to be still more playful, the only text that's dedicated to Dionysius is the 5th one, the crescendo of that first part. And of course, right, the background to that name is Acts 17. He's the one who wants to know about the unknown, or he listens to the unknown God discoursed
Mm.
by Paul,
Mm-hmm.
and he's one of the very few that are convinced. So who is the God made known? It's Christ in the theandric activity, as explicated by Maximus there, in the generation of opposites in the singular living being who is Christ.
Yes.
The very generation is the thing that makes you perceive the strange, unique, mysterious oneness of his identity.
And it forces you to, I mean, what you just said there with Maximus, and you see this again in 41, that he can't talk about that without immediately going to the ways in which the coincidence of opposites has happened in Mary. So he has to talk immediately about Mary.
Yeah.
And I just noticed this yesterday in Irenaeus, that when he's talking about the wonder of incarnation, like he inevitably has to get to the virgin birth,
right,
in order to show how this is both prophesied and unexpected, how it's both revealed and completely unknown, and all of those paradoxes, those opposites that have been reconciled, are right there in Mary, for Irenaeus as much as for Maximus,
right.
and of course for Dionysius too. So it's another reminder of how, what you in the book call Christologic, like, becomes Marian the moment we start to talk about how it happens in the world, right? It can't not, of course.
Yeah. My great regret, probably the main one, I have to say, I don't mean to be immodest, but it's really the only one I have, but it's a big one, is that I had planned a section on Mary and Marian perichoresis for the book. It's just that I had originally planned it for that 4th chapter, which ballooned.
Yeah.
and I thought, this is already such a weird chapter. I had to cut it at the end, but oh man. So yeah, no, I'm glad that's exactly.
I'm thinking about that in part because Sunday, the lectionary text, we're given several gospel passages to choose from. One, the Magi story. 2, Jesus being lost in the temple, Mary and Joseph going back home without him. And that's, of course, the passage that we get, Mary treasured all these things in her heart. Mm-hmm. And when you lay those two texts alongside each other, right, like these magi who seek him out, bring their treasures, versus Mary who seeks him out because she's lost him and finds that he has this treasure she needs to take in, right? That's once again a way in which Scripture is showing she's the one who shows us the way the life of Christ begins to happen in the world, right? So this her life as the prime example of what it looks like to be conformed to Christ. So, it's that I noticed that Francis was, I guess, a couple of days ago, the feast for the Solemnity of Mary. He talked again about how you can't have Christology without talking about the ways in which this bears on her life, the one who bore him, and that from growing up as I did, such a devout spirituality, such a love for Jesus, and yet having no sense of how that mattered for Mary. Like the more deeply I'm drawn into the love for God and the love for God that comes through in the tradition, the more shocking that is to me, right? That the spirituality I was given was so head over heels in love with Jesus. And yet Mary seemed like if anything, a threat to that intimacy, which is certainly not the case in the fathers.
Or in, it reminds me of some of the most acerbic remarks against Protestants in general that Bulgakov makes is in the Burning Bush.
Mm-hmm.
He really has no time for that. It's very clear.
That's right. And yeah, absolutely. And it is a kind of cleansing rebuke, I think. Like, what are you doing? And I think you and I have discussed this before, but it's there in the Gospel of Matthew that we're told multiple times about the child and his mother, like Joseph's responsibility is to the child and his mother. And then right in the midst of that, Herod begins to look for the child because he wants to. That's another one of the texts that we get for Sunday. And it strikes me that like Joseph knows like the child and his mother belong together, right? Mm-hmm. That's what the Magi see when they arrive. They see the child with his mother.
Mm-hmm.
But Herod is only interested in the child. And there's something Rhodian about separating the child from his mother, right? That is violent. It
Yeah.
belongs to the ways of this world. And I still don't know exactly how that plays out. Again, I would say this too in the defense of the, the faith that I came to know first. When I was very young, 5, 6, 7, something like that, memory's tricky, so I don't know for sure, but I was very young. During prayer, I started singing a song to Mary, thanking her for sharing Jesus with us.
Wow.
So I think that that's there. Like
Yeah.
even though it was kind of being intentionally bracketed out, and there were all kinds of anti-Catholic prejudice that were filtering out what the text was saying to us, I still think if you love Jesus, that's going to come through, because we don't get Jesus without her, right? Like you don't have Jesus without this mom giving birth to him, and the wonder of that.
Yeah.
We can't let that be lost on us.
Yes, and I think I'm in the same boat in terms of my childhood and stuff and what we focused on. And what's great, I guess, maybe a sort of, like you're saying, a sort of redeeming quality to all this is because of the emphasis on Christ and specifically his divinity and all that. Of course, the Gospel of John rises almost inadvertently to the top of our focus and attention. And so by the time I had read or got to reading Origen's commentary on John and what he says there about becoming another John, a beloved disciple, and what he says about Mary on the at the crucifixion with "Behold your son," and "Behold your mother," I was ready for that, So you're right. Like, it's not like there's a very coherent anti agenda there that, like, in terms of theology, and so. And actually, that's exactly the point that constantly the life of the Virgin attributed to Maximus makes all the time. It's constantly saying, like, it's very clear that it is the love and devotion to Mary, which is very, very high in that text, like very extremely high, is a direct result of your belief in the incarnation.
So one more point here as we shift to talking about the trauma paper, because I think this is the connection, or is a connection. Let me start by talking about Irenaeus, and then you pick that up with Maximus, and we'll make the shift that way. But what I noticed yesterday as I was working, the chapter I'm writing right now is Born of a Woman. So the previous chapter was Born of the Father, Born of a Woman. And what I'm doing is kind of tracking through the language of necessity in Irenaeus, like where he talks about what's necessary. So there's that astounding line that Father John loves so much about, given that the Savior pre-existed, it was necessary
Right.
that he be born, or that we be created, so that it would have been inappropriate, absurd, for there to have been a pre-existing Savior if we didn't exist to be saved.
Right.
And I love the glee with which Father John quotes that line. And I've been in the room multiple times when he's done it as well. Of course, read it in his book on the mystery of Christ. But what I wanted to do is kind of track through Irenaeus again. Where else does he use language of necessity? And what struck me is that when he talks about what's necessary and what's fitting, and of course, both of those terms are enormously important for the fathers, not just Irenaeus. You see it everywhere, like that language of what's necessary, what's fitting, what's appropriate. But when he comes to the virgin birth, to what happens with Mary, you realize that's where kind of all of the paradoxes gather, where all of these contradictions start to show themselves to us, because it was necessary that God be born. But what no one could have expected, what no one could have, in their wildest dreams imagined, is that God would be born this way. And that would be born in such a way that she would be a virgin, as Maximus will say, because she gave birth, right? Which is not, like, Irenaeus doesn't quite say that, but he's led you right up to that point, right? So talk to us a little bit about that. Like, why is it, do you think, that it's, for Irenaeus, for Maximus, specifically the virgin birth, that shows us why all of this that we've been talking about, the hypostatic union, the communication of attributes, like all of that stuff that's there in the Christological debates. How is it that it has to come down to this? We have to say Theotokos. We have to say this is the mother of God. And that to say that she's the mother of God forces us to hold together things that everything we thought we knew about the world told us couldn't be held together.
So I'm going to just say this and then try to unfold it, or maybe work backwards, or retrofit it, or retro engineer. That's the word I was going for. In my opinion, the coincidence of Mary's virginity and her motherhood is the exact same coincidence of a creation from nothing. A creation that's from nothing, but simultaneously from nothing but God. So the very notion of creation already involves us in a kind of on the surface, absurdity, or precisely though in the form of a confluence. It is not accidental, I think, that whether you go to like Plotinus or you go to Philo or you go to wherever, there is a kind of initial befuddlement, an awestruck aporia of why did anything proceed at all from that which is self-complete, total, no way deficient, infinite, all that. And I do think there are ways to kind of work that, and there's many different worldviews and philosophies and religions that do that. But there is a kind of skipping over that initial aporia in order to get the engine of creation and the relation of God and creation running. And then you can even take it all the way to some sort of eschatology where, whether it's a sort of absorption thing or a sort of like a prudent sort of suspension and juxtaposition, but a distance, as it were, between God and creation that kind of secures a free, loving exchange. Whatever you do at the end. But it really is at the beginning where like that's that really would be the kind of logos of creation itself. The very ground and reason of it is initially appears, it manifests, it is a phenomenon as this coincidence that is unthinkable. And so that's the statement. We could leave it at the level of sort of this, abstract, it just doesn't make sense, it's a paradox or whatever. But of course that wouldn't be true either, and it would be a different way to kind of just skip over the beginning. Why I say all that is because why I think so many of these threads goes back to the virgin birth. I really think there are two reasons, but one of them is the one I'm tracking here, which is that the birth of God from a creature is simultaneously the birth of the creature who is fully created by birthing God. And you could run that with history and eternity, any of the binaries we work with.
Yes.
And so, which is, I should make a side point here. No amount of historical criticism of the virgin birth narratives will convince me that the virgin birth doctrine, or the revelation of God through this conception of the virgin birth, is simply just, it's hearkening back to Greek god heroes or whatever who also were born in this way. You can make of that what you will, and I don't have to deny that there are influences on a certain literal historical level. But nor, though, would I say, if you just did good history, you could sort of prove this miracle of miracles on historical grounds. But the reason why is this. It's because the virgin birth is the ground zero for the transfiguration of history itself.
Yes.
Which would mean that our methods, which have been fitted specifically and sophisticatedly towards history as we know it, if history as we know it is history untransfigured and therefore not yet truly history, then it stands to reason that our tools and the ways that we approach history won't be able to categorize this coincidence of opposites, which erupts nonetheless in the midst of history.
Right, and it's why, again, 41, ambiguous 41, this is where he has to go when he's explaining what it means when Gregory says the natures are innovated.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That what we think we know because we've come to get a read of natures.
Exactly.
Right? That's what our knowledge is really, right? It's
Yeah.
accumulation of assumptions and conclusions about natures, and suddenly something has happened here that innovates, that renews, and therefore alters what we thought we knew about these natures. And it's Mary and what happens with her that is the proof of all of that. And I don't know how. Again, obviously the fathers recognize this. I mean, this is why you get the Theotokos confession in the first place. But for those of us, there's a certain kind of Christian spirituality that somehow doesn't see that connection, and the better I understand it, the less it makes sense to me. Right? Like, how did we get ourselves to that place?
Right.
But also, I think it is obviously hard to think. I mean, that's why Maximus is having to insist to us, that we are looking here at real opposition. There are things that shouldn't be there that are somehow there,
Mm-hmm.
because we've assumed, well, when I say shouldn't, we've assumed they couldn't be.
Right.
It turns out they can be because God has done this that we would have imagined impossible.
Yeah.
And that I think is, I don't want to cut you off, but that's where, when we get to talking about what you say in the trauma paper, like, we have to remember this is the God who can do this, right? And who
Yeah, exactly.
who's done something that is genuinely innovative.
Yeah, and that's all that is very much to the point. I totally agree with it. And it's there's two other notes I would make on that, riffing from that. One is that on the part about this recognition of the mystery revealed, this sort of like the newness, the freshness, as you were saying, the innovation, the truly new thing, which is just the true thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Is I think too, and this is useful for where we are now in history, given some of the sort of downplaying of Mariology or whatever. There's a way in which, and here I'm going a little beyond Maximus, but I think not really unfaithful to him. There's a way in which Mary's role in this is from a certain vantage. I have to be very precise. It's from a certain perspective, like depending on where you are in perceiving the incarnation. It's almost more revelatory.
Mm-hmm.
And here's why I say that. Because I do think if you were raised, like, say, the way I was, and I think probably you are, it's not. I didn't have a problem thinking Jesus was God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, I wasn't back in those debates. I had to sort of retroactively realize what was going on later.
That's right.
But there's a sense in which you can sort of make a premature peace with the innovation here by saying, well, okay, he is God after all, and so he can sort of manifest this paradox, and it's a display of his power. It would be like a one-dimensional reading of Gregory of Nyssa's Categorical Orations, where he's making the point about the fire burning down, and it amazes you because it goes out of its nature. I think he means something far more than that. But you could just read that and be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But what's so great about Mary's role is that you don't have that escape hatch.
That's right. I think
Mary is a creature. Mary has to have it announced to her.
Mm-hmm.
She learns about this.
Yes.
And then accepts it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, it's this, like, the perichoresis as she embodies it, which is simultaneous with the perichoresis that Christ himself embodies and is. That one almost gives you a lens that is for certain people with certain sort of level of bad eyesight, so to speak, it clarifies more quickly.
I agree. Yes. One of the ways I've talked about this, I think this is this tracking with what you're saying, is that what I was given, I don't think this is too unfair, is a kind of love for Jesus apart from the church, and therefore apart from the saints and the martyrs in particular. And Jesus then became God in his birth and death, and in his life became the example that the saints and the martyrs traditionally have been.
Yes, right.
And the problem with that, right, is that Jesus is not a saint and he's not a martyr, right? He's the one whose life is given and revealed in the saints and the martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's no head without the body. And so
Exactly.
to have a love for Jesus without an understanding of what that means for the church
Right.
is to distort something about the way he wants to be known. It's to know the child without the mother, right? And Mary then is
Exactly.
in a playful way, we might say she's the head of the church because she's the place we see the church becoming itself, which is why for the fathers, as John Bear is always reminding us, Mary is a type of the church, not the other way around, right?
Right.
That what we're seeing in her is what it looks like when the life of Christ begins to take hold in us. Right?
Yes.
This is what it's going to look like. And if we don't have her, if we don't have a real person, and I'm going to interrupt myself to say this, it struck me writing this chapter the other day that some of the fundamentalists I've known don't have a problem affirming the virgin birth, although by that they mostly mean that Mary conceived Christ without male seed. They don't.
Right.
They're not really meaning virgin birth in the sense that Maximus is discussing it, but their commitment to that often isn't tied to her as a person being the saint
Right.
who lives, whose entire life is a martyrdom, right? Whose entire life is a sharing in Christ's suffering. So I think we need to not only talk about the virgin birth, but to talk about the woman whose birth it is and the ways in which that is a revelation of who Christ is. We won't get if we only see him. But of course, I think we only see him as he is in the witness of the Gospels anyway. That's another thing that's lost on us, is that we
Yes.
don't see Jesus without mediation. Like if we bracket out Mary in the church, we don't get Jesus. What we get is, again, the Gospels, but we've severed that from the body as well. Anyway, there's so much there for you to respond to, but
No, that's just two. They're kind of the same point, but I want to pick out two aspects of the same point, and it goes along exactly what you're saying. One way to say, I think what you're getting at there is there is no such thing as a God becoming incarnate that doesn't immediately affect everything else about that process and the conditions
Absolutely.
of it, namely actual persons.
Yes.
And Mary above all, and most immediately and proximately.
Yes.
Like there is no Christ without her. And there is no way for Christ to be Christ without her being who she is. They, in a sense, this is where, look, I get it. This is extreme language or whatever. But in that very precise sense, they make each other
Yes.
at the same time. Because she can't be the perichoresis of virginity and motherhood, or if he is not born virginally, and he can't be born virginally without a mother. Like they make each other who they are.
Yes. And there is a kind of, to make Archbishop Rowan happy, there is a way in which there is a kind of asymmetry there, in the sense that she can only do the making she does by the making he does for her.
Right.
But it is really her making. And the humility of God, I think, is and the playfulness of God is revealed to us in that this is the way that he makes. He makes creatures that make him.
Okay, so that's exactly, yeah. And this is so critical. And this is why again, you know how I am most of the time when I critique, most of the time, there are definitely exceptions, but most of the time my critiques are always in the form of like, yes, but there's more, right? And so I agree, for example, that conceived sort of abstractly divine and human agency, or infinite and finite agency, are not in competition. They're not rivalrous. The problem is that just doesn't capture the positive extremity of God's own humility.
That's right. Yes.
And so what I want to say then with you there is exactly where you went, which is that the asymmetry is actually manifest as that asymmetry which can make symmetry and asymmetry into symmetry, as it were.
That's right.
It's
Yes.
a kenotic inversion.
Absolutely.
and I do agree. There's a moment you have to see that you can't just, because that would be to reduce God and creatures to just two finite agencies. If you're like, well, they're sort of equal or whatever, and that's it. It's more that you have to see the whole movement, the whole descent of the incarnation, the actual what they call condescension, or the kenosis, maybe in order to see it filled out and incarnated. The fullness of that is the logic of that. It's the logos.
Yes.
And so, the other aspect there that I love, and it's very crucial to Maximus, is that I do think there's a very big problem, and lots of feminist theologians and other people have pointed this out, and I don't think wrongly entirely, that, look, there is a sense in which, as long as God is the complete unilateral agent, even if you complexify that with, secondary causality and all this other stuff, there still is a sense in which, ultimate responsibility goes to God as the one who's sort of set up and oversees and is constantly infusing all this. But that problem is really just a problem of conceiving all of this as a unilateral agency. And what I think, seeing the incarnation as the true beginning of creation itself, but not just as an idea, but the specific event, the Annunciation to Mary in her pregnancy, in her giving birth to Christ, that is the true beginning of creation itself, makes it so that the act of creation is, as you said, just as much an act of ascent by an actual creature, Mary, as it is an imposition of the Creator that says, well, now you sort of have to, measure up to this, because after all, I sort of set up the ideals here, and you're just sort of approximating that all the time, failing most of the time. And so, here it's no, and this is where I think this is why Maximus loves to talk about the birth of spirit according to Christ. Or no, he says our birth, or our beginning, according to Christ in the Spirit. And the idea is that spirit can't truly be born without freedom. And when I say freedom, of course, I mean free, rational intentionality, love, ultimately. And what you have then is God in his unthinkable love and kenosis can make the very act of creation, just as you said, one in which he makes the creator the creature co-creator.
That's right.
In a mutual assent of love. So the ultimate perichoresis is the actual love effected between Mary and Christ, which makes them themselves constituted in a perichoretic way. And then this sort of is what's rippling out. And ideally, when the church is being truly the body of Christ, it ought to be doing and performing and embodying those same dynamics.
I think that's exactly right. And we shouldn't miss the point, right? That at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, John is hesitant to baptize him because he feels like that's out of order. Like, I should be baptized by you. Don't you understand how this works? And Jesus was like, no, to fulfill all righteousness, right? Not to maintain your order as you understand it now, but to fulfill righteousness, to give it its allness. I have to be baptized by you. And then at the end, when he's ready to wash the feet of his disciples, Peter resists and says, no, like, I should wash your feet, right? There's a proper order here. There's a structure to things, and you're upsetting it. And how we continue to miss that, I think, should shock us, right? That over and over again, I'm among you as the slave who serves while you sit at the table. That's who I am. He says this to us plainly, right? Like, we're not reading between the lines. This is what he's done, what he said, all the way to the end, right? On the cross. And that has to tell us what God is like, right? So, of course, back to the point about asymmetry, of course, God is God and we're not. But it just turns out to be that the God who is doesn't want to be God in a way that keeps that order of asymmetry in place. He won't let that stand. And Mary is the one who's willing to say yes to what he actually wants to do, which is the elevation of the creature.
Yeah, and just to plug it into an earlier thread, that, I think, is actually the profoundest appropriation of Dionysius that Maximus makes. Because for Dionysius, creation is as a result of divine ecstasy.
Yes.
Going out of himself towards us. And what Maximus sort of picks up, which is just a subtle hint in Dionysius, but then makes the whole thing is, and the ecstasy is the incarnation,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with all the implications we've just been discussing.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So let's talk about the trauma paper. Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about, because I think very quickly people, if they're not already anticipating, they'll see how all of it connects. But talk to us a little bit about how you came to write it. I've had the chance to read it at this point. Thank you for it. And let's talk a little bit about how that came to be and what you found yourself arguing as you wrote it. And then let's connect all of that to this
Yeah.
Marian and Christological line we've been discussing.
Definitely an essay I did not plan on writing, maybe ever. It's certainly not this soon. What happened was, well, so I had thrown out this idea, and it's funny. I was reading some of the stuff you sent me that you have, I think, written or spoken or something before, and it is really uncanny. I didn't know that you had said a lot of this stuff too, but I was I had said it before, like in an interview or something, and I say this at the beginning of the essay. I just mentioned, and that was actually impromptu. I wasn't even there to talk about that stuff, and they just said, "Hey, I've heard you mention this before." So we did a whole interview, sort of put up online or whatever. And what was interesting is that a few years later, which happened to be the beginning of this semester, somebody wrote to me, and I began the essay with this story, who herself had suffered a horrific trauma like 8 years ago, and she was like, what you're saying about the potential. What the idea was, that maybe in the end, in sort of the eschaton proper, which would be the true creation, the only creation that fully expresses the divine will for it, that will include the unmaking and remaking of all what we would call past tragedies or traumas or evil.
Mm.
And I just see I was just sort of saying the idea is that I see no reason why time strictures as we know them, whereas we assume, for example, that something is over and done because it's past, that I don't see why that would apply to God's actual act of making, number one. And then when you add the incarnation in there, makes it even more. Anyway, it was just sort of this speculative thing, but I felt like it was important to say, and it's something I was really considering and so on. But she's not a theologian at all. I don't think she's had any training, but she was speaking as a survivor and as a victim. And she's like, this is the most hope I've ever had, because I couldn't even, everyone always just told me that these scars or these vestiges of the trauma left on you will sort of be transfigured in such a way that you will still have them, like the wounds of Christ, but they will be sort of like trophies or like testaments to your endurance or whatever, your virtue or something. And she just actually never got comfort out of that sort of counsel,
Mm-hmm.
and was instead always almost re-traumatized by the idea that this mark will be indelible and will be permanent and irreversible, even if you can kind of re-narrate it or make something better out of it. And so she got, I say all this because not only do I open the essay with that story, but actually it was only the week after I'd received this email from her that I was just out of nowhere asked to contribute to a volume called a collected essays called Catholic Theology and Trauma Theory, which is going to come out with Orbis next year sometime. And they were like, hey, we have this hole in the history section. We need someone to write on it. And I was like, man, I'm not well read in trauma theory. I wouldn't claim any expertise, but I do have this idea. And I started reading around in trauma theory just to see if it would even make sense. And, unless I was just seeing things that weren't there, immediately I started seeing that even this intra, debates and sort of tensions and discussions within trauma theory itself, I was seeing a lot of resonance with some of the stuff I was thinking about theologically. And so I went ahead and agreed to write this essay for that volume, more prompted by the response I had received from her and actually some other people as well prior to that. So the idea then is that in the end, God will not simply erase or delete past traumas and tragedies, but will, in a sense, because past traumas and tragedies prevented or hindered the flowering forth of what ought to have been in their place, which would be an expression of God's goodness. Because after all, every moment in creation is just as much, the result of God's creation as any other, if it's truly creation. that those tragedies would be destroyed, undone, or remade or unmade in order for the true creation that ought to have been in its place to come to fruition, and that is what it means to say creation will be perfected in the end, not a final episode at the end of a line of episodes, but the perfection of all episodes of the line, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's something. This is why we have to recognize the coming of Christ, the so-called second coming, as an event that happens to time and to all things in time,
Yep.
not at the end of time in the sense of the last point on the timeline, right?
Right.
So you talk in the very end of the paper about Christ's wounds. Calvin's sense that Christ has the wounds. They appear as we need them to, but they're not intrinsic to his glorified body. The concerns that people might have with that. Let's talk a bit about that for a moment. Like what are you doing there in terms of wounds in the resurrected body? Shelley Rambo, of course, has written a couple of books at least about this, and I know you quote her as well.
Yeah, it's and the important thing to say up front is that I sympathize with the intuition and motive behind what she's rejecting.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not quibbling with her read of Calvin. She seems right about him, but you would know better than I would. But her critique of his idea that the wounds were there for Thomas to see almost was like a cerebral, like a propositional thing. Like he just needs to come to believe they're proof. And as soon as he does, whenever he confesses "My Lord, my God," on Calvin's read, according to Shelley Rambo, the wounds then disappear, like they've served their purpose, right? They were there as kind of proof or argument. And what now? So I agree. If that's all they were, and if that's what the erasure of wounds on Christ's body, his resurrected body, if that's all that is, then I'm not really interested in that, and I'm not saying that. But what I found in a lot of trauma theologies, at least the ones that I was writing about and sort of dialoguing with and even debating a little, is that then often people sort of make a conclusion from that. Well, Christ's wounds perdure after he's resurrected, such that Thomas could see and touch them. There's a few moves. One is to assume that is the final state of the resurrected Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I dispute that, both in terms like exegetically, it's like, well, you have not yet factored in the ascension, or maybe more importantly, as Ann Jervis points out in her book on Paul and time, that 1 Corinthians 15, I mean, the final subjection of the Son himself will be subject in us, but will hand over the kingdom to the Father. Like in a sense, there's a future, there's yet another phase to come. Mm-hmm. And I just think it is just at least an assumption that the condition of the resurrected Christ in the anecdotes of the gospel will simply remain unchanged through those later phases or events. I would dispute that. But so there's that move. So there's a kind of absolutization of the wounded Christ, the scarred Christ after the resurrection and forever, from now and forever. And then there's the understandable, and again, on the moral level and on the existential and even pastoral level, I'm with them on this. There's a sense of solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
Because Christ is the resurrected victim.
Yes.
And I'm on board with that. I like it when it's put through a Gerardian sense, like James Allison, the victim that comes with forgiving, not in retribution. I'm all about that. I'm with that. My issue, though, is this. If we want, and I'm going to put it a little bit crudely and maybe unfairly, but if we want Christ to remain wounded because we want him to be in solidarity with the wounded, and what we're doing in both cases is assuming an irreversibility of the wounds, both of the victims of history and of trauma now, and him as as it were, arch victim. I can't subscribe to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just exegetically. I think it's a sort of an unfounded assumption, but also I think more like theologically, I can't do that because I don't want to make any ultimate peace with the wounds themselves. And so what I wanted to say, what I sort of suggest at the end of the paper is, I think what we really want is the solidarity,
Yes.
not the wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's correct, then my view, unlike Calvin's, isn't that Christ sort of is just wounded for your sort of mental development, and then he can sort of appear not wounded, so that there's just sort of magically erased. Actually, I would take the solidarity all the way, much deeper. And here I think I have some support in some of the fathers like Nyssa and Maximus, but and I just think in the New Testament, where I would say Christ does remain wounded so long as we are wounded, and actually in a sense, insofar as we're his body and we're wounded, I want to make a sort of identification to say Christ remains wounded so long as we're wounded, because we are wounds then on his body as his body.
Mm-hmm. Well, doesn't Maximus essentially say that? Is it in the chapters on theology where I can't remember the reference, but he says, that the sufferings of Christ are going to continue as long as time continues, right? Like he's going to continue to suffer in his body. So I think you're on very safe ground in saying that.
Yeah, no, you're right. He said, yeah, exactly. He says that there. I mean, he says Maximus says some daring things, not only about the wounds, the sort of sufferings we endure. He says, as long as I'm unruly. So even if my soul is wounded and acting out sinfully, he says, as long as I'm unruly, Christ himself is unruly. But he also says, as you say, like in the mystagogy, he'll say Christ suffers mystically in proportion to all who suffer now, and until. What I want to say is that's what we're really after. I think we're after the solidarity of God in Christ with all who are wounded, but not to valorize or absolutely make permanent wounds and just say, well, aren't you glad at least he's also wounded? Mm-hmm. Instead, what I want to say is Christ takes on the wounds for the same reason he takes on sin and curse and becomes those for us, to destroy them, to unmake them and remake what ought to have been in its place. And so I'd say the solidarity remains, and on that level, on that sort of point, we're all, I think, in agreement. It's just that I think that the solidarity is effective all the way to the point of total transfiguration. And that's what then I would apply that then to the traumas and tragedies of history and say those will be unmade and remade. And something you said in the talk or the essay you sent me is I think exactly right, that none of those, and actually Gregory says it outright as well, it's not like any of those events are passed to God.
That's right.
They're not closed off to God.
That's right.
Which doesn't just mean they play before his face all the time. It also means he has access to the events.
Acting on them. Yes, that's right.
Exactly. And so why would it be impossible for God to continue, as it were, to act on them, even though they're in our past, in order to rectify them in the very spot that they were tragic?
And why I think we need a sense of this age and the age to come, that just as the incarnation has affected an innovation of natures as we've known them, and then it turns out creation and salvation are one act, right? As there, so say the one movement of God. Yeah, so this is Dionysius via Maximus, right? The ecstasy of God, the kinetic movement of God that becomes kenosis, like that. Creation and salvation are one act, right? And the innovation of the natures tells us that. But if we read closely, and I think Origen already has seen this, the same kind of innovation has to happen again, in that innovation becomes true of all things.
Right.
And now we get the coincidence of opposites, not just in Christ and Mary, but in all creatures and in every aspect of their creaturehood. I mean, I think another way to hear Calvin differently from Rambo is to say that the resurrected Christ, resurrection is not something that happens to Jesus after he dies. It's something that happens to the whole of this man's life, including his death. Mm-hmm. And what happens to it is that the whole of his life, from conception to burial, is taken up and established as the DNA of creation. Like, this is what it means to be a creature. And then it works itself out, right? And thanks to God being God. And what that does, I think, for us is insist that in him all modes of being are present. So I don't think it's merely phantasmic when he showed you his wounds. Of course they're his wounds. I think too of visions of the infant Jesus. Whenever I go home for Christmas or Thanksgiving, whenever we're back there, we often pass a shrine to the infant Jesus. Well, of course, he still has his infancy. That's not lost to him.
Yeah.
Jesus is not 2,000 years older now, and so further removed from his infancy. He is still that babe in Mary's arms, right? And that's why
Yeah.
when we celebrate Christmas, we're not talking about something that happened far back in the past. Primarily, we're
Right.
talking about what's happening now, right?
Yes.
And so I think there's a way in which what he can show us what we need to see in order to be drawn into that fullness. As we are drawn into the fullness, we're not leaving behind what was present then. We're integrating it, right? We're bringing
Right.
it up. All that rises is converging, right?
Mm-hmm.
And something like that, I think, allows us to say he's not erasing. He's transfiguring, he's healing, he's reconciling. It's not erasure. And this is why, and you talk about this in the paper too, this is why I find Wolf, and I think the world of Miroslav Wolf, but this is why I find his account of forgetting to be just unworthy of what God has actually promised us, and not hopeful.
Right. And it's just not, I mean, it's interesting to see. I had read Kierkegaard's works of love, but Wolf brings up a really important passage I'd forgotten about, where Kierkegaard says, and I use it as like an epigraph of the essay, where he says, for God forgetting, something like, is the opposite of God creating, because God forgetting, like forgetting our sins, as it says over and over in Scripture, is to return what's forgotten into nothing. And I think there's a slippage that often happens, and even in Wolf, even though I as I say, and in a sense I see him as an exception among many other, a very notable exception among many people whose overall views are honestly rather tragic, and his is at least resisting that in pretty important ways. But where he does, even he also stops short, is that you still get the sense of like, it's like the tragedies are still things or events, which are over there.
Right. We're just drowned out. We're
exactly.
Just them out, yeah.
And he's clear on saying that's why he says they're not just for, like, they just don't come to mind. It's a non-remembrance, but there's still a sense of, there is something there to remember. You just don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
But the deeper thing, and what I think Gregory of Nyssa is especially getting at, which is much deeper, when he says memory, it's not just that kind of subjective recollection. It really is that there is nothing there in the end to remember.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in other words, that is the defeat of evil. Is that evil is a thing that doesn't just, like, this is one way I've also tried to put it. I don't even remember if I do it in the essay, but when I'm talking to people about it, because they do bristle at it, and I understand why. What I'm not suggesting is that, look, history is a line, and sometimes when a tragedy happens, it's like on a segment of the line.
Mm-hmm.
And then what God is going to do at the end is sort of go and erase it off the segment, so that what you have at the end is sort of this broken line.
That's right.
No, that is to assume that events are simply two-dimensional, that they just have mere extension as segments, rather than what I would want to say is that they have depths, they have qualitative depths, and that is what is still accessible to God in his eternity. And so what a tragedy doesn't just happen and fill up space on a timeline. Rather, it covers over the depths, as you said, I think in your essay, the seed. It looks just like a bare seed because, to be honest, a lot of events happen and there's almost nothing else to see but sheer barrenness.
That's right.
But there is always the seed of the Logos himself in all things, and it is always there waiting to bud forth or to be born. Those are the depths like the womb depths of every single event. And so a tragedy is doubly tragic. On the one hand, it itself is a false incarnation, something that will only serve to be destroyed in the end. But then, and that's a tragedy. But then secondly, it's a tragedy because it prevents or almost causes a provisional miscarriage of what ought to have been born.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing. That's the perfection, the draw line of the depths of all of time. That's the fullness of time.
Right.
That's the fullness of time. Or, as you said, just to connect it to one thing you said, one last little, is when it says in 1 Corinthians 15 that God will be all in all, or when it says in Colossians 3:11 that Christ will be and be in all things, it doesn't say in the last episode he will be there. It says in all things, no matter where they land on the timeline, is what I would say.
Absolutely right. And I think we're beholden to that linear, sequential structure more than we realize we are. I mean,
Yes.
I've experienced this in my own life. Like when I first begin to shed it, I'm sure the classes I was teaching, those students that I was learning it with in real time, I think they would bear witness to this, right? That you shed it a little bit at a time. Like you break free a little bit, and you're able to see, okay, I was thinking too sequentially, too linearly, too bound by time, but I've kind of broken free of that. And then you come back and realize, wait a minute, no, I actually am still very much beholden.
It's very hard, right, to hold that.
Very,
Like,
very difficult not to. And so we end up having attachments, not just intellectual ones or abstract conceptual ones, but
yes,
like deep in our hearts, we don't know how to make sense of a healing that would heal us so radically that we aren't ourselves anymore. And we fear that.
oh my gosh,
And understandably, right? And vice versa. I think the fear that this person who had reached out to you was naming is the opposite fear. Is what if I'm healed, but healed only in a way that keeps alive the memory of what I needed to be healed of?
Exactly.
And that's a double bind, right? Like if we're thinking, but that is another form of being locked into the sequential, the linear, the conditions that we think God is bound by as well as we are. We don't know how to imagine our lives as somehow having integrity, nothing being erased. God isn't in the business of erasure, right?
Right.
But recreation that gives integrity to what happened, doesn't take it away, but does in fact transfigure, does in fact heal, does in fact reconcile. I think we lack the imaginative fuel for that. I think.
Oh man, I mean, it's so. I intentionally sent this essay before submitting it for publication to lots of different kind of people because I was like, look, I realize this is sensitive stuff, and it's very. I got to be very careful about what I say, how I say it, how people are hearing it. And I tried my best. I'm sure I wasn't fully successful, but I sent it to a lot of people, and they're not all just intellectual or scholars. Some people are themselves victims of trauma that have worked through it in different degrees, different stages, and some counselors too. And it's very interesting. I got almost down the line, both reactions in equal parts.
Yes.
Some people were like, you were just saying, some people were like, this is amazing. It's such a different sort of hopeful vision that I never even thought possible. And then other people, maybe, and in fact, there were usually people that were a little more further along with dealing with some of their own stuff more directly. I even had one person very honestly and I think courageously say, I think a part of this is that I've worked so hard.
Yes.
I've worked so hard to get through the stuff that was done to me as a child that I almost can't imagine letting it go without ceasing to be who I am. Even though that same person was like, but I also agree with you that I don't want to say that I needed those things to happen in order to be who I am. And all I want to say is maybe then, as you said, the failure of imagination, maybe here's what I'd want to say. Is it true that God finds a way for goods to manifest even through and in the midst of evil? Yes. Does that therefore mean that there was no other way and that there is no other way that those exact same goods could be manifest and bestowed to you for your participation in them and embodiment of them than through those evil conditions? And there I want to say no. This is that divine judgment, the work of divine judgment. We've got to separate out very carefully things that to us seem inseparable because they just are both of elements are just they just are our autobiographies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we've just identified ourselves with them because they do honestly demand so much time, attention, energy, work, emotion, sweat, tears. It's such a force of gravity that we tend to just relinquish and say, it must be the thing that's grounding me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think thought through in this different perspective that we've been talking about, unless we want to make peace with tragedy, which I don't think most do, then we need to think all the way and say, well, you will even come to see that that is a part of the lie of evil, is to make itself seem originary,
Mm-hmm.
fundamental to who you are, apart from which you could not be who you have become.
Yes. Yes.
And there I would want to say, no, we've boxed God in too much. His judgment, his creation, his working out of the incarnation and all of its effects on creation and in the perfection of that creation. We simply haven't allowed that to be as incredible as it really is.
Yeah. I think that's it. I know you and I are on the same page here. I mean, this is where the way we're theologizing needs to be livable, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not a game. It's not thinking through possible moves. It's not formulaic. It's not looking for the most elegant, mathematical solution here or formula. It's how does faith respond to what has actually happened to us, what is happening, in a way that is genuinely hopeful. And I think we should at least let these counter testimonies, the ways in which when we talk about these things, what comes up are the voices of, I want a God who can heal me so that this has not happened, and others who are, I don't want God to heal me in such a way that I'm erased.
Yes, exactly.
And I don't know who I am apart from how I've recovered from what has been done to me. And I think all we can hope for theologically, of course, God's going to do right, and it's going to be better than anything we could have imagined anyway. But what we can hope for, the reason we need imagination is not to be right, but to create the space in which we don't get caught in that double bind.
Yes.
Even if we're comfortable in one bind or the other, right?
Right.
Like don't be at home in either of those. And I think one way of kind of creating a little more imaginative space is to say, what if in the end we are allowed to co-conspire, not just with God, but with those we've wronged and those who wronged us.
Yes.
In a reworking of things, right? In a kind of negotiation of what is real. And I think there's a way in which we're already doing that with memory.
Yes.
I mean, memory is constructed, and we often feel that as a fault, that something's like our memory is faulty. We don't remember things as they actually were. But what if the creative dimensions of memory are already a kind of foretaste, if somehow frustrated, already a foretaste of the work we're meant to do. So that when Paul says, we are to judge angels,
yeah, exactly,
that some of that work is this work of collaborating with, again, the people we've wronged and the people who've wronged us in ways that, and again, I don't know enough to know for sure, but I think there's something to the language in kind of Pentecostal charismatic traditions of generational curses. I've read just a little bit about epigenetic research, so like how all of that holds together. I don't know enough to know for sure, but I think all of it is pointing to something very real, which is the sins of our fathers and mothers come down on us. Right? And there are all kinds of ways in which what's going on in my life today has its origin far, far back in my past. Who knows how far back? And genuine justice, right? What we imagine as the last judgment, that is a setting, not just a manifestation of God and all of his goodness, but an actual creative setting right of things. If we're right in what we were saying Christologically and Mariologically earlier in this conversation, then somehow we're coming to the table to have a say in the way that gets reworked. Yes. And I think that at least gives a little space for us to get free of that double bind we've been discussing.
Yeah, completely right. And what's great about it is, I think, immediately and practically, it illumines all that we do. I mean, the reason why you pray for forgiveness of, or you pray for, to forgive your debtors as we forget, forgive me while I forgive the debtors against me, the sinners against me. It doesn't mean you force a sort of premature reconciliation.
Yeah.
It does not mean that you skip over the work of justice. In fact, what I would argue, and what I sort of suggest a little bit at the end, is it actually makes you much less fearful, so that you can be more clear-eyed about what has exactly happened. and what the ramifications actually have been, precisely because it relieves the seeing, the perception of having to become absolutized and
Mm-hmm.
permanent.
Mm-hmm.
So I can fully face the things that have been done to me or that I have done to others, and I can confess them, and I can repent of them, and I can pray for forgiveness or pray for those that have wronged me that have not asked for forgiveness. I can already begin to prepare myself for the work of reconciliation that, if not affected in this life, will be affected as the completion of all life. And so your spiritual life and everything we do in the liturgy and all that we do with each other, when we confess to each other, when we learn, when we do introspection, as Gregory says, to know yourself is not just a Socratic command. It is
Mm-hmm.
it's because your life is hidden with Christ and God. You can't know Christ without knowing yourself, and vice versa. So the work of doing all that is eschatological now.
Mm-hmm. That's
It's already plugged into that. Exactly, because the unfolding of creation isn't limited to the sequence.
That's right. That's right. And it reminds me of this passage somewhere in Paraphysion where Eugene talks about, they're kind of three movements or transitory shifts. So I can't remember exactly how he says it, but essentially there's a kind of knowledge we gain, the mind comes to know. Then there's another shift in which the mind comes to be wise. Like we move from not knowing to knowing, and then we move from knowing to being wise. But then ultimately we move from being wise into unknowing. We move into God, right? And that's the end. I think some of what we're describing here is that shift, right? That when you are wrong deeply, when you are traumatized, if you live through it, if you survive it, you have that shift from not knowing to knowing. You are forced into a kind of awareness of reality, and there's an incredible pain. It's a rupture.
Mm-hmm.
If you are able to find healing, you move toward wisdom, you move into wisdom. Here's how I live with what has happened to me, with what I've made of what's happened to me, with what I find in God's mercy I can bear and even thrive having lived through this. But I think we always have to leave room. And here's why I'm coming back to this line in Origen. He's reading Hebrews 10. The law is a shadow of the good things to come. And he makes the point that there are not two realities named here, but three.
Right.
There's the shadow, there's the thing that casts the shadow, and then there's the light of the things to come that,
Mm-hmm.
because of what has already appeared, casts a shadow that we recognize in the law. And I
Right.
think some of that threefold unfolding, right? But the room we need imaginatively is room that is only given if we understand we're moving into God. We're moving into
Yes.
an innovation that is greater than what we've already known, right? That the as Origen will say, the new covenant is not the things to come. It's the
Right.
sign of the good things to come,
Exactly.
right?
There's
The
the
healing
eternal
we're
gospel.
receiving, right? The healing we're receiving now is not being in God. It's the sign that we're going to be in God. And
Yeah.
I think that will get us kind of, again, just a little bit of imaginative room not to be stuck in which is it? Am I healed, but my past is erased? Or is it my past is settled and it gives me identity, and yet I'm haunted by the fact that I'm the one to whom these things happened? And to put it even more kind of pointedly, I guess, and I've had people bring this up to me in pastoral context. I don't want to be in the life to come. I don't want heaven if my victimizer is going to be there with me.
Right.
How could
Exactly.
heaven ever possibly be safe if this person is somehow there? So
Yep.
then hell becomes a necessary holding place for those who are too much for us to bear, right? But I think all of that binding, the double binding, is a result, again, of being locked into the conditions we think God has to operate within. So I'll give you the last word on that front.
Yeah. No, it's man, there's so many different directions, but I think that if this is sort of gets too mind bending or weird or strange to people, one of the things I always come back to is basically just this: The only thing that can be permanently and totally true is what is permanently and totally an expression of God's will.
Hmm.
And God's will is nothing but goodness and love, and there is no other motive behind it. And so, insofar as something, no matter where it falls on the timeline as we perceive it, insofar as something does not yet, or maybe almost not at all, manifest the divine will in its goodness and love, which is just God, then
Mm-hmm.
I cannot understand how we can call that a proper creation of that will.
Yes. Yes.
And so it is, in a sense, the intuition, the engine driving all of the speculation is simple. It is that simple conviction that in God, God is light, in him there's no darkness at all.
Yep.
That is, I always bring it back to that. It's always where I want to land, and that's basically what guides everything I try to think about. And so, like, one of the last lines I say in the essay is perhaps original trauma. It's sort of a term that you find in trauma studies. Perhaps original trauma's last lie is that it's truly original at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm getting, because there is only one origin and one end. There's only one alpha and the omega.
That's right.
And so plugging it into the Eriugena thing, one provocative way I like to state this sometimes is to say that the perfection of creation is God overcoming having to have had create at all.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why Eriugena's last division, right, is God who neither is created nor creates.
Yes.
But that only makes sense, to bring it all the way back to our original starting point. It only makes sense because that is where he's discussing the totus Christus.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he does the ubiquity of Christ's body, almost like that'll be used later in Eucharistic stuff. But for him, that's the cosmos, and it's the creation.
Well, the title of your course, God, Humanity, the Cosmos.
Yeah.
How did it run? What was?
Yeah, that's it. God, the human, the cosmos.
We hear three things.
Right.
What I realize is that you just said two things about the one.
Exactly.
Like the God who is the one who is human and is the cosmos.
Right.
Christ is all and in all, right? To quote Paul. And it's like that is a vision that allows, I think, all of this to kind of hold together. I can't help but end with this, thinking about Mary. I was talking with Father Kenneth about this, Father Kenneth Tanner. One of the things that we need to affirm when we're affirming the virgin birth is that Mary's delivery of Christ does no violence to her body. Right? Not only is Christ conceived without violence, or even without a male partner at all, violent or loving, but she delivers without violence to her body. And in this, it's both like something striking about the tabernacle and the temple is that the bloody sacrifices are done outside the temple. There's blood brought in, but you don't do the blood shedding inside the holy places. Like that's done outside.
Right.
And then, of course, the Eucharist is a bloodless sacrifice. Right here, nothing is dying to give us life.
Right.
And what we have in Mary, I think, is that revelation. God does not need violence, does not need to do violence to bring about good. And that same kind of innovation is what I think we have to hope will be happening to all that has already happened to us.
Yeah.
And Aquinas, and I talk about this in the lecture, Aquinas actually brings up the example of a woman who's been abused sexually to talk about whether or not God change the past. And I don't think it's an accident that he brings that up. Right? It'd be easy, of course, to pathologize it, to assume the worst. But I think there's a reason he brings that up, that there's something about having that kind of violence done to us. And I think maybe a place to pause the conversation for now is simply to say what the incarnation tells us is that God is a God who doesn't do that and doesn't need that to do the good he's going to do. And because of the miracle, and it's not enough to call it a miracle, because of the innovation that the virgin birth is, I think we're also being told of a God who's capable of doing something about those things that have happened. Not just that he doesn't need them and he doesn't use them, but that he can do something about the fact that they have happened.
Yeah, and that's what's so crucial about that is it responds exactly to what I think is one of the most fundamental temptations, and actually very natural and understandable ones, which is just to look around at the world, to survey, the vestiges, the remnants, the ruins, that, the wake of tragedy after tragedy. You could blow that up into a much bigger scale and say, well, look at the evolutionary history of the cosmos or the planet, of all the species themselves. How much death, predation, tragedy, survival, nature red in tooth and claw has been required for you to live right now as you are. And what you do is you can look at all of that and start to really believe very easily these are simply the necessary conditions of my life. But how deceptive is that?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's to say you're assigning your own true origin to something that's not just other than God, but that is the opposite or contrary to God.
Yeah. You're making evil constitutive. Yeah.
And this is where I think, Paul in Galatians, this offhanded line that I don't think has been given its due weight in my knowledge. Having begun in the spirit, do you now come to completion in the flesh?
Mm-hmm.
What I think he's saying there isn't just, some sort of moralistic thing. I think what he's saying is much deeper. It's you have come to the origin, your true origin.
Yeah.
But now you're looking around for other origins again.
Mm-hmm.
So you're, in other words, you're trying to absolutize conditions, but
Yes.
there is simply one condition, and it's the one that Mary herself responds to. I mean, look, how bizarre is it that God speaks creation into existence? Who is he talking to? And in the Annunciation, you have a hearer.
That's right.
Yet, isn't the point of creation that you have to first be created in order to hear? But in the Incarnation, in the Annunciation, in Mary, what you see is the coincidence of all these, such that those rules that seem to be, again, the absolute necessary conditions of creation itself, that even God has to bend to, as if it were some sort of pre-existent matter or something he has to work with. Instead, what you see there is the creation, the true creation of the hearer, and the one addressed in the creating. It's one and the same event and act.
That's right.
And of course, that is simply the freedom of the Spirit, whose ultimate fruit is love. And that's the gospel.
Yes.
The gospel is there is nothing else necessary or fundamental to any and every one of you, no matter what's happened to you or what you've done. None of that will ultimately define you or originate you. And that's, I don't know what better news there could be.
Mm-hmm. And when we say, let your will be done on earth, or let, as Eckhart will say, let will be thine. Let all things just be what your will wills them to be. We're making a statement about the past too. Let your will be done in my past, to my past, to what I think of my past. And the hope of that, again, is this God who's able to make without unmaking, who doesn't need destructive, violent force in order to make something creative, right? Like he doesn't need the contrast. He doesn't need darkness for light or brokenness for healing. And I think that leads us right back to the Christological stuff. So, Jordan, thank you for this, man. It's been wonderful, as always, to talk with you. Best of luck teaching those students how to understand the Bible.
Yeah, please pray for me.
Will do, man. We'll talk soon, okay?
All right. Thanks, Chris.